Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm hoping that logging on and the audio and all of our wireless stuff works all right for you. My name is Erin and I work here at Roots to Harvest. And for you, those of you who don't know, Roots to Harvest uses food as a tool to work with people. And normally every year we host a 4-part workshop with Brendan and Marcelle called Garden Like a Boss. And due to present circumstances, that had to be canceled this year. And so kind of last minute last week, we reached out to Brendan and Marcelle to see if they would consider doing something like this, because as I go online, I see so many people wanting to have access to their own food in their own gardens and just looking at, how to do that right. So I think that speaking to some experts who grow food in the north, who can have seen it done at all levels, is just a really helpful thing. All of you are muted, so you can't speak. And Brendan and Marcelle have both been shared with the questions that everybody shared beforehand, which is really great. I want to do 2 things before I give it over to Brendan and Marcelle. One is, and I know you answered this, some of you answered this, not all of you, in the form, the Google form that you filled out, but I'm going to share a poll with you because I'm kind of practicing. So I'm going to launch this poll and I'm asking you to tell us about your garden experience. You're either a newbie who's never gardened before, you have experience, people are voting. Brendan and Marcelle, can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Some of you are saying that you can grow food. Really, none of you totally know your stuff and just love webinars. I don't believe you. I know that every time I do a garden workshop, like at the hospital meeting, there's always like some master gardener in the crowd that's like taking notes on all the things I say wrong. Usually, and then we have a good laugh about it. Perfect. So most of you can grow food and want to do it better. 18% of you, that's just 2 of you, can have some experience, and 2 of you have never gardened before. So welcome to people who have never gardened before. That's really, really exciting. I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. The other thing that's new, oh, look, I can share the results. Just doing that because I've never done it before. There you go. So the other thing I think that's new, that's interesting to check out, is that Roots to Harvest, at our 2 urban farm sites, we host community gardens there as well. And there are many community gardens around Thunder Bay and around Canada and the world. But right now in Ontario, community gardens have been excluded and are not allowed to happen because of the COVID-19 measures. So there's a movement provincially to try to get that changed. So I'm sharing a link with you right now for an open letter. If any of you are interested in taking a read and adding your name to the list if you haven't already, regarding the community gardens. I think there's some really safe ways of doing them. So with all that said, I'm going to hand it over. I'm going to leave the screen and stop my video and put myself on mute and hand it over to Brendan and Marcelle. I'll let you 2 introduce yourselves and we'll go through questions, and I'll be watching the chat on the side. So if anybody has any questions, you can send them to the panelists here. Things that aren't being addressed, we'll sort of let Brendan and Marcelle have their way for about an hour and 15 minutes, and then we'll go over to open questions or just dig deeper into some of the ones. All right, so I'm going to hand it over.
Hey, okay. Hopefully we're out here in Pass Lake. So hopefully our internet holds up for the time that we're speaking and we're spending with you tonight. My name is Marcelle. This is Brendan. We run Sleepy G Farm out here in Pass Lake. We've been growing vegetables out here for over 10 years, 10, 13 years, something like that. And we run a really popular vegetable CSA membership, a community-supported agriculture program where people get vegetables from the farm on a regular rolling basis during the spring, during the fall, and over the winter. And I can see through the list of participants here that we know lots of you, not all of you, but welcome. And we're excited to share things that we know about growing vegetables here in the Thunder Bay area, and also to find out what you want to know, because we're happy to answer your questions.
Okay, well, hi everyone, welcome. It was pretty neat to see so many people interested to learn about gardening and to maybe get a little bit better at their gardening. So, and thanks to Rooster Harvest for putting this on, because I think right now everyone's looking for something to do that connects with others, even if it is over the internet. So we got a list of all your questions, and I've got them here, and we will do our best to get to all of them. I've kind of broken them into categories just to try and keep this train on the tracks for the next hour or two. But I want to just, as I looked at all of the questions, I noticed a big theme around starting a garden from scratch, and there was lots of questions about soil and where to get soil, and that kind of relates to starting from scratch. So before I answer that, I just want to get everyone on the same page with respect to understanding what soil is and how that's going to impact what we're growing and how successful we might be in growing. So soil by definition is really four mineral elements: sand, silt, clay. Those are your three mineral elements, and then some organic matter. The percentages are not going to go into right now, but suffice to say that most soil, and the soil that we grow our crops in, is about 6% organic matter, and the other 94% is comprised of various mixtures of sand, silt, and clay, which of course is just the natural soil. That is what we call soil. And if we were to import soil, quote unquote soil, through by buying potting mix or peat moss or compost, and we were to fill our beds or raised beds or containers with that medium is not really the same thing as what is even out in your backyard under the grass. The medium that we tend to fill our beds and boxes with is very, very high in organic matter. Sometimes it's in excess of 50%. And so it's really a really different kind of growing medium. Okay. So in our greenhouse, and right now we have lots of plants started in our greenhouse, and they're all growing in trays. And the medium we grow in is primarily peat moss, with a few other things to help with porosity and soil and moisture retention, that type of thing. Very great for rooting young seedlings. It's a very easy environment for them to explore their roots through and get anchored, but it really doesn't have much in the way of nutrients. And so, those plants are really dependent on us providing nutrients, either in a liquid form or we add some compost to the potting mix as well. Again, to contrast that with what's out in the field and what might be in your existing gardens, it's not potting mix out there. It is lots of sand and grit and pieces and clay and sticky stuff. And the difference between those two, and this is really the key thing here, is that in real proper soil, not only is it full of all those different minerals, it's full of biology, whether that's earthworms, all sorts of bugs, insects, and then of course the microbiology that you can't see, like fungi, bacteria, nematodes, all sorts of things. And the potting mix, or the kind of artificial rooting medium, is more or less void of that soil biology. And why that matters is, and most nutrients, plant nutrients, are primarily made available to the plants by way of that microbiology, which eats or somehow dissolves and transforms those mineral constituents into things that the plant can then take up.
For example.
So that's a long way of trying to just contrast the difference between your parent soil that might be what you'd find in your backyard if you were to put a shovel into the ground, and that which you might find if you import it, or you've had to bring in a truckload, or you buy it in a bag. So it's kind of like apples and oranges, and both definitely have their upsides, but I think it's really important to know that they're not the same, and that I think it's a fair assumption to say that most people on with us tonight are looking at growing organically. So that is to say, without the use of synthetic fertilizers. And if that is the case, then you really want to be trying to build the soil biology in whatever garden that you're growing, because it is the biology that really makes the magic happen. So, so there was lots of questions about how to start a garden from scratch. And, there's lots of different ways to do that. The first decision that needs to be made is whether or not you're going to grow what we would say at grade. So basically just where your lawn was, you're now going to turn into a garden, versus what lots of people tend to refer to as raised beds, which are typically wooden boxes that are sitting on the surface of the ground and then filled up with a medium. So that's the first decision to make. If you haven't already made that decision, then let me be the first to try and urge you towards growing at grade, or in the garden, or in the soil that is in your backyard or wherever you're growing. The reason I say that is two things. One I've already kind of spoken about, which is trying to build upon the microbiology that already lives where you're gardening or hope to garden. And the other one being, it's a lot of work and money to build boxes and then have to get them filled with another purchased input. So that's the first thing. For those of you that have already got raised beds and that's what you're working with, that's not a problem. You just need to know that what you have in there is generally, it's more like potting mix, so the stuff that we would start our seedlings in, and it's less like soil, which is what we would grow our crops in the field.
Yeah, and we would refer to that as living soil because it has those microbes, those organisms that Brendan's talking about. That said, you can always improve whatever medium you're growing in, whether it is the living soil or whether it is more of a medium that's in a container, for example.
So without getting too technical, because soil science is obviously a pretty big world. Like Marcelle said, over time, whatever mix that you're growing in or soil you're growing in, it will change and improve over time as the soil biology grows and breeds and multiplies. And one of the substances that we're looking for in living soil are these kind of secretions that come from the microbiology. And these secretions, sometimes they're invisible and other times they are visible to the eye. But what they really do is they hold all the various particles and pieces and elements of your soil or potting mix together into clumps, little clumps of various sizes. And that's a party for the microbiology that lives in your soil. They love that. They want the diversity of an environment that has larger particles and bigger and smaller particles, and it's not one homogeneous type of medium to grow in. So as an analogy, if you would think of a bowl full of flour, that would be a very homogeneous soil texture, and that is not that hospitable or conducive to the microbiology. If we were to contrast that with, soil scientists often use cottage cheese as being kind of the ideal kind of look, not so much touch, but the kind of look of good living soil, where you've got bigger particles and smaller particles, and they're all swimming along together in that soup. And the soup in the case of soil would be that glue, those excretions from the microbiology. So whatever you're growing in, just know that your number one job as a gardener, beyond trying to grow food to put on your table, is to try and grow microbiology. I can't understate that enough. Those of you who have taken a course with us before, or you've heard me speak, you will perhaps remember me referring to the most important thing that happens in your garden is eating, breeding, and pooping. And we want to see the microbiology.
And it's not you eating,
just to
breathing,
clarify.
and pooping in your garden.
I mean, that's one way to fertilize your garden, but that's not the way we're endorsing. We want to see the microbiology eat. We want to see them fed and nourished. And when they're fed and nourished, then they breed, and then they populate. And a byproduct of all that and the eating is the pooping. And it's the poop of the microbes that you can't see that is really the magic that makes your crops grow. Again, not without getting too technical, the quote unquote poop of your microbes is literally molecules of elements that are plant available and can be taken up in your plant and turned into, your vegetable. So
what people really want to know is, where do you get this living soil you speak of?
Right. So the short answer is you can't really buy it. You have to build it. That's the short answer. And as Marcelle alluded to earlier, we're strong advocates of gardening with a piece of ground that you have. And even if you live in the city and your backyard, of course, when the house was built, it was typically kind of landscaped a little bit and smoothed off after the construction. They frequently will bring in loads of sand just to kind of smooth out, make a nice surface to establish a grass on. But that's actually a better start in a lot of ways than starting from total scratch, where you're building boxes and then, and again, at an expense and time, and then trying to fill those boxes with whatever you can get, which is not easy to get, nor is it cheap. And when you do finally fill those boxes, it's going to take some time to build the microbiology and build that soil.
Yeah, because if you do buy a product, like let's say a truckload of something from somebody, which, maybe you've tuned in to find out where to get this soil, and to our answer to that is actually we don't know. There are vendors out there that sell triple mix, what people might call topsoil, but we don't actually know who those people are. And I'm not exactly sure. I know that there's some businesses out there that do that, but that what they deliver to you and what you purchase might not end up being that hospitable to growing a vegetable crop. That's the same type of mix that they would use to like backfill any type of like flower beds, or backfill, a construction site, like after a house is built and then, like Brendan was saying, they smooth it out. It's the same stuff. There's nothing necessarily more hospitable about that stuff than any other type of fill. So not to say you shouldn't buy it, because if you need material, you need material, but that material isn't necessarily better than what you already have potentially.
Right. And if so, we'll explore this in two ways. So let's first talk about starting a garden from scratch with just out of your lawn, and then we'll talk about starting a garden from scratch by building boxes and filling them. Okay. So the great thing about your lawn is that it's already got a lot going on for it that is going to set you off on a good foot for turning it into a garden. There's already biology living there, and we know that because wherever you have living plants rooted in the ground, you are going to have microbiology. You may not have it in huge numbers, but it is there. It's just a byproduct of living plants. You're going to have microbiology. So even in your lawn, you've got that going for you. The roots of your lawn, once you turn that sod and you kill it, it's going to start to break down, and that's going to be a release of nutrients as it breaks down, essentially as it composts. And it's also going to provide a good amount of organic matter, which organic matter plays a few important roles, but it is habitat for the microbiology. They live in among the little fibers and weaves of organic matter in the soil, and they can actually eat and digest those bits of organic matter as they break down, and then they'll poop it out, and the poop is now kind of food for your plants. So a sod or grass is actually a really good start because it's The raw ingredients are there. The only thing that is necessary at that point is a bit of time for it to break down and for the nutrients to release. So the way we would recommend people to start a garden from scratch, if you've not made any preparations at all, if you want to do it this year, if you're really hell bent on making garden out of grass this year, then the best,
which is totally possible.
It's totally possible.
Totally possible.
The best thing to do is what they call double dig. And double digging is when you, well, I should first say, the first thing to do is take your lawnmower or weed whacker or scythe or whatever you got and give
scythe.
Yeah,
for all those people who have a scythe at home.
Might be. Give your garden area a haircut. Give it a buzz cut. Real trim. Okay. That will just that will prevent your grass from resprouting once you invert it. Okay, so give it a good haircut. And that's also a nice way you take the lawnmower, you can kind of square off an area and you got a good idea of what your garden will look like. Okay, step 2, take your garden spade. That's the one with the pointed end shovel. And
he means just a digging shovel.
Yeah, as opposed to like a flat end, which would be for other purposes, but so many shovels. Anyway, put your shovel in, and you want to basically go down about 8 inches, which is about the depth of the blade of the shovel, and you want to invert the sod. So you turn it so that the roots are facing up towards the sky and your freshly haircutted lawn is facing down. Okay, and you go along the whole way and you basically bury the sod that way, and you're basically inverting your whole garden space one shovel or spade at a time.
So take a scoopful out, and then your next scoop, put it into the hole that you made the first scoop. So one scoop goes into the hole you made from the previous one, and that'll, so you're sort of just filling the holes, and then it'll look like
kind of like a rough lumpy moon.
Yeah,
it's like
it'll
a
be
moonscape.
like, yeah. So, but you'll see your soil. It'll be exposed. You'll see what you're dealing with. It'll be wet, so it won't be ready to work yet. This is just the first step to get it flipped over, to get it exposed, and to try and kill the grass that was growing there, or the weeds, whatever you've got.
Right. So that's the first thing. So by inverting the sod, you're going to exclude light from the tops of that grass. And so if it doesn't see light for a period of time, then it starts to die. And then its roots, which are now facing right under your feet there, are going to start to break down. And this is a really good kind of clean slate to start your garden from. If you Google double dig, you're going to see some nice photographs of how that's done, and it'll maybe make a little bit more sense to you. Okay, so that's step 1, double dig, invert the sod. And the next step then is, as Marcelle said, once you do that, you're going to see what you have. You might have a lot of clay in your soil, and if that's the case, you'll know because it sticks to your boot when it's wet, and it has some virtues, but it's also got some downsides. Or maybe your soil is going to be really sandy, which is good as well, but it's going to probably require a little bit of organic matter to help it from not drying out so quickly. But either way, you're going to see what you have. And with a fresh kind of brown slate to start your garden with, you then now, this would be the time where you should add some amendments. And so amendments is probably the thing that I think is neglected the most by gardeners. To put seeds or little transplants into your garden soil or into a container and expect to get something it's a little naive, right? In the sense that you can't get something for nothing anywhere in the world, except right now you get $2,000 a month for staying home. But other than that, that's the only example that, so plants are going to require nutrients, whether you're growing carrots, lettuce, broccoli. Every cell that plant produces and grows from something. It came from nutrients that were in the soil. And if those nutrients aren't in the soil, then your plants are going to struggle. So the amendments that you'd be putting on, this is where you can adjust pH for those that may have a really acid pH. So you can add some lime or wood ash to bring your pH up. You can go to Canadian Tire and get a little soil test kit, which will tell you the pH of your soil. And the pH, or the acidity, is really important because there's a sweet spot. It's basically 6.5 to 6.8, so just slightly acidic. That's the kind of happy spot for all that microbiology to do its work. When your soil pH is less than 6 or more than 7, your microbiology starts to die off because it's just not it's a very hostile environment. So doing a simple $10 soil test from Canadian Tire to figure out what your pH is probably $10 well spent. If you find that your soil pH is really low, let's say 5.5, then you can make it wood ash or calcium of some sort, and that will bring it up closer to about 6.5. And you can look online, you can Google how much to add per square foot in order to make that jump from where you're starting to the 6.5 target. Conversely, if your soil is too alkaline or too basic, it's maybe 7, 8, then you just need to add sulfur, elemental sulfur, which is a powdered sulfur. It's organic. It's just an element that's been mined and then ground to a fine powder. It's yellow, and you can add a little bit of that to bring your pH down. Okay, so adjusting your pH is kind of like the first thing to do when you're starting your garden, because if your pH is not in the right zone, your availability of nutrients to your crops will be greatly impeded.
That's another downfall to purchasing material, because it isn't adjusted for pH. So you who knows what will be available to the plants with that type of medium.
So the topsoil that Marcelle talked about earlier, it typically the way there are people in Thunder Bay that sell them. Typically what they do is they find like a peat bog and they dig into it with the backhoe or the excavator, and they get down to that black peat, which looks great. And, I know a lot of us think that black earth is the stuff that crops really grow in, but I don't know if you've ever walked through a peat bog, but there's not a lot really growing there. I mean, there's things growing, but the diversity is very, very slim. There are only a few species of trees and other plants that will live in a peat bog. And that's because the peat bogs are very acidic, and because they're wet. And when they're wet all the time, the moisture displaces oxygen, and it creates an anaerobic environment, and that anaerobic environment over time becomes very acidic. So if you're purchasing quote unquote topsoil from someone, it's typically going to be fairly acidic because the main constituent in that mix is peat, which is by nature acidic.
So I would like to answer a couple of these questions. Well, Brendan checks his page from the fire department. So the question is, if you remove the sod, are you removing the microbes?
So you're just inverting the sod and letting it basically compost on the spot, so the microbes are not actually going anywhere.
So yeah, so double digging is just flipping the sod over. But if you have removed the sod, or you intend to remove the sod, then yeah, you're going to be removing microbes from the soil. There's still more underneath, but that top layer, a lot of the microbes live along the roots of whatever is growing on the surface. So if you can maintain that, that's why we suggest, mowing it down. I don't know, is the grass growing in town yet? Probably not, at least not a lot. So potentially, if you're going to do it sooner, is the ground even thawed? If the ground is thawed, then yeah, you can start flipping it over. And that brings us to the next question. Should we start mowing our grass and weeds and double digging right away, or should we wait for the ground to be dry? And I think that double digging helps the drying process. So no, I don't think that you necessarily need to wait. I wouldn't take it a step further beyond the double digging until it's dry. So you could invert the soil, and let it sit there, and it's going to be dark, and then you're going to see the soil kind of get lighter brown around the edges, and then fully brown, and then that's when you know it's dry. And at that point, then you can choose to like rototill or break up break up the clods, however you choose to do it, so that you can make a seed bed or something that looks more like a garden instead of like the moon, Hopefully that answers that question.
Okay.
So there's one more question here. If topsoil is acidic, should you mix dirt from your lawn when growing seeds inside, or just use regular topsoil? So I think that is a question about what to use when you're growing your seeds inside. And you can mix soil into your potting mix to use in your seed starting. You can take soil from outside, and there was a time when we used to do that, but then it just became too onerous because we needed so much of it that we were literally gathering piles and like bags and buckets and too much soil. So I think it's a good practice because then it conditions the plant to the type of soil that they'll be experiencing out in the garden. But there are some drawbacks too, right? Because the soil from outside might have pests in it, pests being weeds or pests being insects that you might be bringing into your house that might hatch before summer comes because they're in your house and they're warming up, and then you might infect your house plants or your other seedlings. So it's a balance. You can choose to do that or not. Right now we just use a potting soil mix, which we fortify with a purchased compost, and we're not even using our farm compost for that because of the same reason. It's got weeds and pests in it, so we just use products that aren't going to cause an outbreak in the greenhouse. So that's something to consider too. Hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, so getting back to the outside scenario, you've double dug, you've maybe done a little bit of a pH test. If again, you can add your sulfur or your lime, which you can get.
Brendan gets really specific about some things. And so if you don't do the pH test and adjust for that, don't panic about it. It's not do or die. Likely you'll be able to grow stuff regardless of whether or not you adjust for pH.
And you'll just, if you find that your plants are struggling mid-season, then that might be a reason why, then it might be a cause to try a test, because again, if the pH isn't correct, your plants aren't going to be able to feed properly. It's just that simple. So other things that are great, compost, we should mention compost. So compost is kind of like the thing, it's kind of like the shotgun approach to solving a lot of your garden problems. Good compost will be a fertilizer. It will inoculate your garden with microbes because good compost is rich in microbes. It will help to alleviate compaction problems in your garden if it tends to get really smushy and sticky after rains. Compost is a great soil conditioner. It's kind of like I very loosely say it's kind of the cure-all, but compost is definitely a great thing that should be added to the soil on a yearly basis. And if you're starting from very scratch and you've just done your double digging, that would be the perfect time to add whatever compost you can get your hands on. And what that's going to do, again, compost, I don't really think of compost so much as fertilizer, although it does have some fertilizer value. I think of it more as when I spread compost, and we spread, tons and like literally tens of tons of compost onto our fields each year, I feel like I'm just I'm inoculating the soil with lots of microbes. I use my compost pile as kind of like an incubator to grow and hatch, and that eat, breed, poop pile. And so if you're making compost at home, then add it to your garden soil at the onset of the season. And I'm not sure we'll have time too much, unless we have time at the end to talk about how to make compost, but
and that's something that we've talked about before in a lot of different workshops, dedicated composting workshops, and then also in our Garden Like a Boss course. When Brendan talks about compost, what he's he isn't talking about your box of rotting vegetable scraps in your backyard. I mean, that could become compost, but what it is today is likely not the compost that we're talking about, because if you can still see what you threw in there, i.e. like the peels or the avocado pit or I don't know, what else do you find in there? The cow turd. The rotting bits of if you can still see the cow manure in our case, because we're composting manure, if you can still see what it was, then it's not cooked, it's not ready, it's not good to use on your garden. So that's a whole other thing, is how to make good compost. And that's maybe something we can touch on at the end or talk about at a different time. Because not a lot of, some of us are busy, some of us aren't.
I do want to say John Street Landfill does make compost through their yard waste collection program. And although they're not able to it's free. You can get it, you buy the truckload for free if you're a city resident. They cannot endorse it for use in vegetable gardens, but the product is tested for toxicity and heavy metals, and it is all very good. I think that if I lived in the city, I would not hesitate to take advantage of that product that's free. And yeah, so I'm just putting it out there. I know that it's been tested. I know the person who does it, and I feel confident that it would be something that would be of benefit to most people, especially if you're starting from scratch, just to get things going.
I don't know if anybody knows this, or maybe you know, Brendan, if you go to John Street Road landfill to pick up a load of this stuff, do they load it in your truck for you, or do you have to load it yourself?
I think if you pull up with like a half ton, they'll use the loader and they'll fill your half ton.
That would be nice too.
Yeah. Or you can take buckets. I'm sure you can figure out. There's a question about the ideal time to test soil now versus 3 weeks from now. It doesn't really matter, to be honest. So if you're doing, I'm not sure if we're talking about a pH test. I didn't talk about nutrient analysis, but for those of you that are really serious about gardening, or maybe been doing it for a bunch of years, you can take a soil sample and send it off to a lab. It costs about $35, and it gives you an idea of all the different. It tells you your pH, it tells you your soil texture, it tells you your potassium, phosphorus, and your big three. And it's about $35. We use a company called A&L Labs. It's in London, and you just send it by mail. In terms of the time to take your soil test, it really doesn't matter that much. We do it in the fall so that I have all winter to figure it out, make a plan, and purchase inputs to address deficiencies. But the turnaround time on soil testing is pretty quick. And if it's just a pH test, then it doesn't matter when you do it. Okay, so trying to get back on track here. I know there's lots to get through. So we're still adding, after you've broken your ground, you can add your amendments. And then the next thing is to kind of work it in to the soil pretty lightly. So, most plants, they're all rooted in the top 4 inches of the soil, some plants deeper, but you basically, when we're really trying as gardeners to really address that top 4 inches of soil, maybe 6 inches of soil. And so whatever kind of ingredients you put on the surface of soil, whether it's compost, you can put in things like kelp, which you can buy a kelp meal to put some potassium in there, blood meal if you need nitrogen. If you're inclined to use synthetic fertilizers, same thing, put it on the surface of the soil, and then just lightly rake it in or lightly rototill it in. And that kind of puts all your ingredients in the top surface of the soil for your plants to access when they go in. Okay, so that the double dig method is, I think, the best way, because it retains the sod and takes advantage of the sod breaking down over time and then releasing some nutrients and also the organic matter and the microbes that are living along the roots of your grass. Another way to start from scratch is if you don't need to grow this year, then a really great way to do it is to tarp off the area. Again, give it a haircut, nice and trim, and then tarp off your area, your garden site, with an completely opaque material.
Do not use one of those woven tarpaulins from Tooltown or Canadian Tire that just break apart and then all that plastic goes into your garden.
Yeah. Use something, the use of silage plastic is becoming quite popular among gardeners. And if you've driven through the Slate River Valley, you see a lot of the dairy farms, they have those big white piles of feed, which is white plastic.
For the tubes. Yeah,
big tubes. The other side of that white is black, and it's an opaque food grade polyethylene plastic. They would be happy to give you big chunk that they've torn off because they just send it to the landfill, or you can purchase it through the Thunder Bay Co-op Farm Supply on rolls. Or you can get creative and use other things. You know, I don't need to go into the list of materials, but ultimately, if you put an opaque material on your garden site, it's going to exclude the sunlight from getting in for the course of the summer, and basically everything underneath that is going to die off. And when you remove it in the fall or even midsummer, it's just going to be brown soil.
And sometimes worms under there and living things.
Yeah, and very, very frequently you'll see when you pull back the tarp or whatever you've used, because it's warmer, the microbiology really has a heyday, and they start to eat as things start to break down and die. So that's the most prime way to start your garden, is if you had a year in advance, you could kill off the sod, and then you're starting with like a really nice clean slate, and that sod is already composted.
Yeah, and so there's a question here. If you are using, or you have one of those plastic weed covers, if the ground has been covered already, is it best to remove it and turn the soil after? And the answer is that is yes. Because you want to create a seed bed. So it looks brown and it looks ready to plant in, but it's actually really compacted. You want to be able to aerate that soil so that there's air pockets, because the roots need air to be able to penetrate into the soil. So you do want to start working that soil a little bit afterwards. So you could double dig that at that point and then let it dry, because it's going to be wet because it's been covered and it's going to be moist. So then that's what you would turn it, and then wait for it to dry, and then you could rake it into a seed bed, or if you're going to rototill. And I've said rototill a few times, and it's not necessary to have a rototiller. It's also not necessary to use a rototiller. You can do all of these things with hand tools. With a spade, that shovel Brendan was talking about, with a hard rake. And another tool that I really like is a digging fork. So not the hay fork, not the pitchfork, but the fork with the really stout tines. There's usually 4 of them, and they're thick, and you can use it to both turn your soil, but also to harvest your root vegetables once they're grown.
So that's a good. That reminds me that this whole talk about microbiology and soil. Think of it this way: the microbiology is not that much different than you or I. They need the same things. They need food, they need shelter, they need water, and they need oxygen. That's kind of like the 4 ingredients that they need. So anything that you can do as a gardener that encourages that, the oxygen, the water, the food, and the shelter, that's how you get them to multiply, to breed, eat, poop, breed, eat, poop, and continue on. So aerating the soil with that hard fork, that digging fork that Marcelle talked about, is quite key. That's also the reason why, if you know anything about compost, they talk about turning the piles. Well, turning the piles is so that you can fold in more oxygen, because they need oxygen as they increase in numbers. At the end of the day, whether you're gardening, however you're gardening, whether it's in a container, in a raised bed, or at grade in just a kind of conventional garden, your focus should be on trying to create a nice, hospitable 4 to 6 inches on the top for your plants to live in. Okay, they need a little bit of help, especially you put a little seedling in. If you're transplanting, little tomato plants or little broccoli, or you're seeding carrots or lettuce, those very small tender seedlings, they're babies. They need a little bit of help. So the way you can help them is by making sure the food is there for them, and making sure that the top 6 inches of the soil is sufficiently aerated and soft enough that they can explore their little baby roots through. Once they get to be a stronger, bigger, taller plant, then they can fend for themselves a bit better. They have a greater capacity to dig down deep to find water and nutrients. But when they're very young, you need to be putting your little plants or your seeds into what we call a soil that's what we could say has good tilth, or is quite friable, or it crumbles in your hand very nicely. No little plant is going to thrive in a lumpy, crunchy, rough garden or seed bed. It needs to be a little bit more soft and hospitable. Okay. Did you have to?
I'm just going to answer this question about burning your lawn before double digging.
Great, love it.
You like it?
Oh yeah. And what that'll do is that's going to be a release of nutrients. Phosphorus is one of them, which is a great thing. It's hard to get into your soil, and then it's going to leave a black charred area, and then of course the black is going to heat up much quicker. The soil will warm more quickly. Burning it's awesome. Unfortunately, there's a restricted fire zone across the province right now, so you can't burn. But I love burning. So.
Yeah, cool idea. Also, what I think is cool about it is if you've got a bunch of weeds, because you're in the country, you said, if you've got a bunch of weeds growing there, and if you burn them, then it'll hopefully sterilize those seeds too and burn the seeds, because the weed seeds are a pain in the butt.
As a quick aside, many years ago when we first bought the farm, we burnt one of our fields, and it was about 10 or 15 acres. It was just a thatch of overgrown hay that had grown and died for years. And then we burned it up, and we had a huge fire, and we had a hell of a hay crop the next year because of the release of nutrients back into the soil. And yeah, so that's a good one. Okay, so I talked a little bit about starting from scratch, outside in the conventional way. But that's not the reality for a lot of people for different reasons. You might be already have raised beds or garden boxes, or you just really have your heart set on growing that way. And that's totally cool. There's just, what you just need to know is that the material that you put in there is generally going to be very high in organic matter, which means that it's likely going to be fairly acidic. So you should be, if you're buying, so you might want to really do a pH test there and add some lime, which you can buy easily, or you can use wood ash, so long as you haven't been burning like glossy magazines and just straight wood. Wood ash is a great way to bring your pH up and also add some potassium, which is another great thing. And then the other thing, if you're growing in garden boxes or raised beds, is that just know that you're not really growing in soil. You're growing in kind of potting mix. And we would never grow like broccoli plants, for example, or corn plants in our greenhouse in trays and potting trays, because there's just not enough nutrients there. And you'd be constantly fertilizing them with a really digestible fertilizer. So if you are in that situation where you're growing in a box, then I think it's really wise to buy some liquid fertilizer. There's lots of non-synthetic based liquid fertilizers that you can buy at the garden center. To be honest, I actually think that the Bowles Feeds on Cumberland is a really great source for a lot of garden amendments. I've talked a little bit about bone meal, feather meal, kelp, lime. All these things are available at Bowles Feeds, and
I think you can buy them in bulk too, so you don't have to buy like a huge thing of it. You can get like a small thing of it.
Yeah, and it's really, I think they're actually the best go-to for some of these kind of things that you've maybe never bought before. But liquid fertilizer, you can get a liquid fertilizer is really, it's very digestible for the plants. So you dilute it with water and you give it a good watering, and right away the nutrients are available. And that's great. That's what you want, especially if you're growing in a garden box that's full of, a questionable material that is low in fertility. Great, no problem. I mean, quite frankly, that's what hydroponics is, right? Hydroponics is growing crops, lettuces and tomatoes and whatnot, in an inert material, coconut husks, styrofoam, all sorts of like non-organic materials, and it's on a drip feed with water and liquid nutrient. And it grows crops. So
that said, I'm just going to interrupt here. So what Brendan's suggesting is to potentially have some type of a liquid fertilizer, and the stuff that we use is like a fish emulsion. It's a fish fertilizer, so it's basically made out of it's a fish juice. But seaweed emulsion is a good one too. So these things are organic, they're non-synthetic, so you could choose to do that. Now I'm going to level with you. If you're growing in a garden box, or you're about to set one up, or you need to bring in some material because you don't have enough soil in your yard, or it's just, it's for whatever reason, Brendan's suggestion of going to John Street Landfill and getting some of their compost sounds pretty good. That's an idea. The other thing would be to go to, Canadian Tire or whatever supply store and get some bags of whatever potting mix or peat moss or whatever they have, and then some bags of like the sheep compost, and just trying to like make something that isn't just all peat or all compost, just trying to make a mix. And then, you know, and then mixing it with whatever material you might have there, or putting it into your box and then going from there. And yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but at least it's going to get you a start on something. That's what I would do. If I had a bunch of pots that I had to fill, or a big container, then that's what I would do. I would go and get some potting material and add some like bagged compost that you purchase, and start from there. So hopefully that helps you, because we've kind of talked a lot about soil and what to do and what's great. But if you just want an easy answer to like, what can I buy to make my garden? That's what I would do.
Yeah, for sure.
And if that was unclear, just put it in the chat and I can clarify that.
Okay, so in the interest of moving along, I'm going to move on to the next segment, which deals with seeds and starting seeds and some more crop specific questions.
And Allison, I'll answer your question a bit later on. I'll let Brendan continue with that, and then we can talk about what kind of things you can make at home.
So for those, there's one question here is from someone who's just moved to the area and starting to wonder, like, when do I start seeds? I'm new to this area. The answer is later than you think. And I say that to everyone, even people who grew up here. The idea that May long weekend comes and we're in the garden planting, like that's definitely not the case. And we really would advocate and dissuade people from doing that. I actually think a more realistic time and more ideal time for most people up in this area is more around, I would say, June 7th. You know, even on our farm, we, even a few years ago, we made a very intentional move to plant even later than we had for the previous 10 years. And so we don't really plant very much in the garden until about the 10th of June.
In town though, it's a little bit more forgiving, and don't plant on May long. Enjoy your weekend, whatever that looks like this year, but even in future years, just enjoy, go fishing, whatever. And then they start getting your garden going the following weekends. So like the next weekend you could pick up the stuff, or whatever you needed. And then the first week of June, that's when I would start to put stuff in the ground outside. That's not to say you can't be starting stuff before then, starting your seedlings, even having stuff and putting it out during the day and bringing it in at night, but don't plant it in the ground until then. If you put your hand in the soil and it feels cold, don't put your plant in there. If you don't want to put your toes in it, the plant does not want its toes in it. That's when you know it's ready. When the soil feels warm, not on the surface, not when you put your hand on the top, but when you put your fingers in, about up to your knuckles. And that feels okay, warm and not cold. That's when you put your plants in.
And that's really the most critical part. We've talked quite a bit about actually making a hospitable environment for your plants to grow in. Well, they need warmth. That's part of their kind of shelter that they need. And we get really tricked, especially in Northwestern Ontario in May and even sometimes April, where you're out there in shorts and t-shirt getting a sunburn, and it's warm. It can be 20 degrees and you're getting the bug to start planting. But the reality is that the air may be warm, but the soil could be stone cold. And we've learned the hard way many times over the years that when we plant crops in cold soil, they fail to thrive. And very often those are the crops that we end up having to plow under and plant again at a great expense for us 2 or 3 weeks later.
Or the seeds don't germinate, and that's a huge thing. I get a lot of questions like, oh, my such and such didn't come up. Chances are probably you planted it too soon if your whatever beans didn't come up, your whatever.
So every seed package that you get on the back, it's going to say, germinates in 7 to 10 days between 18 and 22 degrees Celsius, for example. It will give a temperature range and a number of days that you should expect the crop to germinate if it's in that temperature range. So really pay attention to that. So certain vegetables, like peas, for instance, they germinate at a much lower temperature. And so that's something you could put in earlier. But if you put your zucchini seed in the ground at the same time you put your pea seed, what's going to happen is that zucchini seed is going to be in the ground so long, waiting and waiting and waiting for the soil, for the temperature to be correct for it to come to life, that in the time that it waits, it ends up just rotting and dying. Okay, so you can very easily avoid that by just holding off. And if you look at your zucchini seed package and it says, it needs to germinate at 22 to 24 degrees Celsius, wait till your soil is kind of close to that range, then put it in, and you'll see it come up rather than just rot in the ground. So this is the main reason why we tell people to just hold off. A question just came in about hastening the soil warming. So some people have great success just taking like clear poly that you would use for vapor barrier in your house and tarping off the garden site. And it will do a couple of things. It'll superheat the top inch of the soil, which will, it'll sterilize a lot of the weed seeds. It'll also kill some of the biology that's living in that top inch, but it's a give and take, but it will warm your soil and it might give you a little bit of a head start. The other thing that people can do is create little kind of domes over their plants to create a little bit of a kind of a mini greenhouse, and you can get really creative with that. I know that we have a neighbor who just uses panes of like window panes, old wooden framed glass panes, and he just makes like a box around some of his plants, no top.
It's cool. He just sets it up like a playpen.
It's like a playpen for his tomato plants, and it works. It makes it a little bit hotter during the day. There's no lid on it, so there's no need to ventilate, so it doesn't cook the plants. And it's not a greenhouse. It's very clever. You can also, a very vogue gardening practice in the Victorian era was using cloches, little garden cloches, which are like these little glass bells that you could place. So you can Google that. You can make your own cloche, and I think you can buy them at Lee Valley.
I can answer this question really quick for Julie. She's got 3-year-old chicken goop. Sounds gross, but yeah, that sounds good. And then she's also got a pile of topsoil that's been sitting tarped for 2 seasons. What I would do is I would mix the two together. Make a whole new pile, shovel it over, chicken shit on top, more of the soil, more poop, mix it all up. And then you could probably use that. I mean, you could probably use it right away, or even better if you used it tarped it again and used it the following year, just give it a year. That pile is going to heat right up too. So don't tarp it right away because it might catch on fire.
There's a question that came through about storing and germinating old heritage seeds. So seed saving, we don't really do very much of it on this farm.
Luckily, Superior Seed Producers can answer all of your seed saving questions, but we'll get to
the question is around recommendations for storing and germinating. So seeds need to be stored cool and dry, and even can be very cold, even freezing. I'm not saying you should keep them in your freezer, but the coldest room or basement or garage in your house is a great place to store seeds for until the next season. But the caveat is that it needs to be very dry. So putting them away dry into a sealed container like a Rubbermaid or something. So long as they're stored cool and dry, they will store well and be viable. For the number of years, the viability of the seeds really depends on the crop. So certain crops are only really viable for 1 or 2 years. So examples of those seeds would be corn and parsnips, whereas other seeds are viable for many, many more years, like 7 or 10, like peas and beans. So just look up some seed saving stuff to find out.
If you look up like garden seed viability chart, there'll be a whole chart that will say, how many years a seed would be good for.
And if you take our Gardening Like a Boss course next year, we have that chart that we'll give you. So, okay. One other thing I want to say about seeds is don't buy seeds from Canadian Tire.
Buy the best seeds that you can afford.
Yeah, don't buy seeds at the Canadian Tire or Walmart or Home Depot or anywhere like that. Buy really good quality seeds, and there are lots of different seed suppliers. Superior Seed Savers is our local kind of growers, network of growers, and they have stuff for sale. But there's other seed houses or seed distributors all across the country. We use one called William Dam in Southern Ontario. It's the main one we use. They all have nice websites with lots of glossy photos and the good descriptions. That when you buy from a proper seed supplier, you're getting a better quality product, because for one thing, that's their business, is distributing seeds and handling seeds. So they're very careful with not cross-contaminating. So it's a real bummer I know this happened years and years ago. I love iceberg lettuce, and I bought a package of iceberg lettuce seed from Canadian Tire at the checkout or whatever, and we grew it out, and I was so pissed off by the end of the season that it wasn't iceberg. It was a wrong seed in the wrong package. And that happens all the time with these kind of like, I hate to point them out, but you guys know them because you've seen them at the stores. Those are not seed suppliers. They're just a brand. They buy the seeds from the real seed suppliers at the end of the season when they had leftover inventory, and the seed suppliers aren't going to keep that inventory and sell it to serious home gardeners or farmers. So they dump them to companies that then put a little package and sell them at Canadian Tire.
So that said, buy the best seeds you can afford. There's lots of places in Canada that sell seeds, or even from the US. Yeah.
And getting back to the seed saving thing. So, unless you're really interested in seed saving, I would say just hold off on that endeavor and just focus on the gardening, unless that's really your passion. If you want to intend to save seeds, then you're looking for open pollinated varieties. That means that you can save the seed and plant it the next year, and you can expect to get the same thing. To be totally honest, we don't grow very many open pollinated varieties on our farm. We mostly grow hybrids, or F1s, they're sometimes called. And the hybrids are seeds that have been selectively bred, not genetically engineered or modified, just selectively bred to be really good at one thing. So whether that's like the sweetness of the carrot or the deep purple color of the broccoli or whatever it is, those hybrid varieties are very trait specific. And why that matters, especially in the north here, is that one of the traits we're looking for is shortness of maturity. So shortened DTMs, or days to maturity, or frost tolerance or cold tolerance, or tolerance to long days, which we have, which is difficult for some crops. So if you, again, with the seed suppliers, they will very often denote the northern suitable variety with a little snowflake or some other way to code that that's good for the north. I would urge you towards those varietal selections because they work really well up here for a good reason. Okay.
While Brendan gets back to a new topic, I'll answer Allison's question about homemade liquid fertilizer. So the answer, have we ever used it, and what would we make out of it? So she suggests comfrey or nettle soaked for several weeks. We have made compost tea. So that's taking like finished compost that we've made and then put it into like a barrel, and then pumped air through it, so oxygenated it, and we've used that. But that's different than a fertilizer. That's more of like a tonic, so to speak. So it's
like a stimulant.
Yeah, like a stimulant. So it would provide soil with capacity, but not necessarily nitrogen or any of your other sort of macronutrients. So, and we use that as a foliar spray, which means onto the leaves versus onto the soil. So comfrey and nettle we have not used. I don't know what the deal is with those. Maybe you've read something that that recommends them for certain applications or for certain nutrients or something. But I know people who take fish guts and make compost, or not compost tea, but make fish fertilizer out of fish guts. I don't personally do that because it stinks. And even when you buy a fish fertilizer product, it still has a smell, some worse than others. And then I just require so like so much that it would be difficult to make it all. That's not to say you shouldn't do it, but it's totally possible to do it. You know, you could take kelp meal and make your own seaweed spray. Kelp meal is easy to get, and you can buy a bag of it at Bulls Feeds. You could soak that and you could spray that on. Those would be good things. Hopefully that answers the question. And, you know, there's nothing saying that you couldn't experiment with that stuff, but it might not be the like silver bullet, but it could be a complementary therapy for the garden.
Okay, there's a couple more kind of seed related questions I just want to check off. So one question is about seeds from your own garden from last year. Will they work? And the answer is, if they were open pollinated varieties, then yes, you can. If you saved them and they've been stored correctly, you can plant them and have reasonable expectation you'll get the same thing. If they were a hybrid, or this says F1 or hybrid or something like that on the package, then it will grow a plant. But it may not be at all like what it was. So it's a bit of a crapshoot.
And you have to consider that there are distances you need to observe when you grow certain crops so they don't cross-pollinate. So let's say you grew 2 different types of squash in your garden last year, and you got spaghetti squash and you got acorn squash. And let's say you saved the seed from the acorn squash, being like, yeah, I liked those acorns, I'm going to grow those again. The seed in your acorn squash might have cross-pollinated. It might have gotten cross-pollinated with that spaghetti, so you might end up with some Franken squash.
Okay. Do you soak seeds beforehand, and can you grow old seeds? The old seeds, again, look at seed viability. It goes by crop. Some seeds can be very old.
You can do a germination test before you hit the garden with them. You could do the germination test now.
Easy way to do that is take some paper towel and moisten it good and wet, lay down 10 seeds in it, and then fold it over so it's got contact. The seed has moist paper towel contact on both sides. Put it in a Ziploc bag. Put it on the top of your fridge because it's going to be about 20, maybe
somewhere
20,
not too hot, but
not
warm.
Too cold. So it's warm, it's moist. And if you put 10 seeds in there and 7 germinate, then you've got 70% germination. Yeah, so you can test it that way.
Mm-hmm. Then you don't have to guess, and you don't have to second guess and wonder. You can just do a germ test and find out.
And that kind of is a good segue into one of the other questions about, do you pre-soak your seeds? And the answer is, yeah, we do pre-soak some seeds. Marcelle's the chief propagator. She can talk about what seeds she
I don't soak the stuff too much. I soak the pea seeds before they go out to the field. Which makes them harder to put in the ground because they're all wet. But it really helps them, they're going in wet, so they don't need to warm up and get wet. And, they actually, when you soak a pea seed, it pretty well doubles in size. So that's how much water it needs to collect before it sprouts. So with bigger seeds, I find that's valuable. With smaller seeds, no. So another thing that I might pre-soak would be like a zucchini or a squash seed. Again, a large seed. But you don't want to soak it so it gets waterlogged. I literally soak it for maybe 12 hours before planting it.
And then when you do go and plant it, you got to make sure that it's going into soil or potting mix that is the right temperature. So again, getting back to soil temperature, super, super important. Okay. New gardener to Thunder Bay. How do I have the most success with beets and carrots?
A lot of people want to grow beets and carrots because they're such great foods and you get so much, and it's almost it's wonderful when you pull it out of the ground. You're like, wow, that's a big beet or a big carrot.
So beets and carrots are kind of like our bread and butter. We grow a lot of them, and so the answer there, the simple answer is pay really good attention to creating a really nice rooting zone. So I talked earlier about really concentrating the 4 to 6 inches. For those crops, especially for carrots, you need to have more like an 8 to 10 inch rooting zone. So that means the soil needs to be sufficiently loose that you could put your hand, down to here very easily. And if your hand can push down and explore, no problem, then that little carrot seedling or beet is going to find its way through the soil. The greater depth of soil it's able to access, the greater access to nutrients it has through its lateral roots, and then you're going to have a better carrot or beet. The other thing I'll say about carrots and beets, both are root vegetables. all root vegetables need phosphorus, and it's just root vegetables need a lot of phosphorus, and phosphorus is not that abundant in most soil, but an easy source of it would be bone meal. So you can get ground bone meal, again, from Bowls or somewhere else, and make sure that when you're prepping your garden in the spring, that you put a good dusting of that bone meal in the surface of soil, and work it in lightly, and at least it's there for when the plant needs it. And carrots and beets, they're actually, in a lot of ways, they're the most ideal crops for this growing climate because especially in the case of carrots, they grow beneath the ground, which means that they are less affected by the daytime, nighttime swings in temperatures. And that's kind of Northwestern Ontario gardening in a nutshell, is that we have really warm days. A 30-degree day is not uncommon in July or August, but then that same day, it'll go down to like 12 at night. And that just doesn't happen in more southern climates. And so that swing from 30 to down to 12 is hard on a lot of crops, but root vegetables are less affected by that because they're in the soil, and the soil is regulates that swing.
And then with beets and carrots, one last little thing, definitely spend the money on better seed. Don't cheap out on beet and carrot seed, because you want to get out of the gate ahead of the curve, or ahead of everyone else. And the very first step is securing your seed for beets and carrots. So get the best seed that you can afford.
Seeds are really kind of one of those things in life that the more you spend, the more you get. And I know that's not true of most things, but if you're looking through your seed catalog or you're online, and one variety costs literally 3 times more than the next one, and they look the same, I would go for the one that costs 3 times more, because the chances are it's going to be that much better. And the cost of seed relative to the nutrient value you get when you actually harvest that crop, it's nominal. It's really, you're splitting hairs at that point. The difference between a package of seed that's $2 and $5, it's a non-issue when you're talking about actually having a good haul in your harvest. The last thing I want to say about carrots and beets, which also applies to pretty well everything else, but specifically carrots and beets, is really good weed control. So once you plant that garden, say in the beginning of June, the work is not over. And I would also go further to say that planting the seed, a harvest is not a foregone conclusion after planting the seed. Planting the seed means that the process has been started, but it doesn't mean that you're going to get to the end and have what you would consider to be a successful garden. The difference between success and not is making sure that while the crop is growing, it's adequately nourished through the soil. And if you're finding that your soil is kind of crappy and it's just not doing the job, and you'll know that because the crop is maybe yellow a bit, it's just not really growing very vigorously. Well, it's too late at that point to really do much to the actual soil. But that's where you could be looking at getting some of that liquid fertilizer that Marcelle talked about and giving it a bit of a boost. And that'll
or you could get some compost, side dress the top,
and then water it in,
which means just put compost around the plant.
Yeah. So don't neglect feeding the crop mid-season if it's kind of struggling. And then the other thing is, if you see that there's lots of weeds in your garden, guess what they're doing? They're eating nutrients. They're starving nutrients and water from the crops that are next to it. So good weed control is really critical. And we're like super hardcore about weed control on our farm because it's like the difference between us making money and not based on, the yield. So, and carrots and beets specifically are, they're kind of wimps when it comes to competing for nutrients. So keep all the nutrients for those ones.
Yeah. And a lot of people will have success with their beets and carrots their first year gardening, which is great, but then a lot of people don't. They're a little bit trickier. Carrots and beets need to be thinned. You can't just slam the seeds in and say, oh, there's so much growing here. If they're growing too close, you're not going to get something. So they need to be thinned down. That's a big, I don't know, you're going to talk more about spacing?
You know what? I think that, yeah, we'll do that. We'll go there next.
Spacing and timing.
Okay. So I just want to address, there was 2 questions about what's known as companion planting. And companion planting is when certain crops have a beneficial relationship when growing in close proximity to another. So a common one is carrots and tomatoes, if growing together or really close to each other. For some reason that's not really that explainable, both crops do better because of being near to each other. So companion planting is a really intriguing part of gardening because there are lots of known and anecdotal beneficial relationships as well as detrimental relationships. I'm not going to go into them because there's a lot of nuance to it, and it's just
and there's lots of books about it.
And there's books about it, and it's beyond the scope of this conversation. But certainly it's something that we observe. Like one of my jobs on the farm is designing our crop rotation and doing the layout, and I take into account a lot of these beneficial and detrimental effects that are known and proven through science, and then some that are just observed and known through experience. I guess what I'd say is that, there is a book out there, the one that's kind of stood the test of time is called Carrots Love Tomatoes. It's kind of like the first book on companion planting, and it's, I think, a good start. Unless it's something you really want to pursue for other reasons, whether it's just straight an intellectual reason or just interest, I would say just focus more on the points that we talked about gardening really well and taking care of your soil and making sure that your crops are adequately fed, and then maybe just leave the companion planting until you're having success.
It's
with the
companion
basics.
planting is very nuanced, so you may or may not even know whether it's working. So not to say that it does or doesn't, but
I'm not trying to diminish it at all, because it does. Like I said, I use it in I don't actually plant two crops to each other in our fields because it doesn't work for us, but I definitely observe some of those known
rules about before and after planting.
Everything that's growing after onions does better. And even the soil scientists don't know why. They just know that if onions were on a piece of ground this year, then next year, whatever you put there is going to do better. Just like if you grow a brassica crop like broccoli or cabbage or cauliflower, anything that follows that is going to suffer because that crop is kind of a prick.
Well, it's got some stuff.
It's got some problems. Anyway, that's going down a rabbit hole that I can't go down. So I guess now at this point, there's some questions about season extension and what I've kind of termed here as systems. And so I want to address those. And first, just to pick up where Marcelle left off about some pitfalls. Before we came on here this evening, we said that we should address what we see as being the most common pitfalls among gardeners. And I think we've already talked about some of those. So one of the common pitfalls is, not caring for the soil properly. So not working it in a way that creates a nice rooting zone for your plants. So, taking care of your soil. And if you treat your soil like dirt, then it's going to treat you like dirt. And, to treat someone like dirt is a kind of a bad thing. And so that's why we don't actually even use the word dirt around here. It's soil. Soil is something that is full of life and is valuable. Dirt is kind of like garbage. It's what you wash off your hands before you eat supper. So treating your soil really well, feeding the microbiology in your soil. So, keeping in mind that the hardest working people or organisms or beings in your garden are the ones you can't see. They are the amoebas and the nematodes and the bacteria, and the things you can't see, but we know that they're there. And the way we know that they're there is that any organic matter that lays in your soil over time will disappear. It will compost, it will break down, and it'll become unrecognizable. That's the magic of compost, and that's the magic of microbiology. So you need to take care of them by feeding them, by keeping them adequately moist, keeping them warm, and oxygenated. Okay. And then the other thing is food for your crops. So fertilizer, either liquid or put into the soil at the beginning of the season.
So the other pitfalls that we talked about are people planting too early, which we already talked about, wait later. And then when you're caring for the once you've established a crop and it's growing and you can see it growing and you said, oh yeah, there's my little seedlings all growing there. Perfect. I got a nice thick row. Well, you're going to have to go in and you're going to have to thin them out, which means you're actually going to have to kill some of the little plants that you grew.
Most of them.
so that you can, so for your carrots and beets, for example, is a prime example. If you don't thin your carrots and beets, you will not succeed with carrots and beets. You actually need to have, about 2 fingers distance between each of those little sprigs coming up. And you're thinking, holy, I'm wiping out a lot of plants here. And yeah, you're going to wipe out a lot of plants, but those plants are not serving you. The ones that you're going to be leaving are the ones that are actually going to grow food for you and your family. So we can talk more about thinning if you want to, but this is a key thing to having food success from your garden. I mean, you could grow a pile of carrot tops, but that's not what you want.
Well, this is probably the number one thing is, as gardeners, especially in the spring, we get a bit overzealous. We want to grow everything, but we only have a small space. So we end up putting it all in. Everything's crowded. And then we don't do the heartbreaking work of actually killing most of what germinates. And, in our gardening course, we spend almost an entire evening just talking about thinning and observing the space requirements of plants. And the space requirements translate directly to the nutrient availability in the soil. So getting back to what I said earlier, you can't get something for nothing. If you have a bunch of little carrot seedlings all crowded shoulder to shoulder in a small piece of your garden, there's only so much nutrients to go around. And so if you take out 90% of that population, then the 10% will actually be able to access those nutrients and thrive and actually produce carrots for you. So again, on your seed package, it'll say
the distances,
the distance, the depth to put the seed, and the distance between the seeds.
And so we're talking about direct seeding and thinning out, but then if you're putting your transplants in, like if you've got like your zucchini transplant, you're not going to plant it 6 inches from the other zucchini transplant. You're going to put it, 18 inches to 2 feet away from the next zucchini plant. But when you put them in the ground, it's going to look really sparse. You're thinking like, oh, there's hardly anything in my garden. But just wait, like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, it's going to be a sea of green. It needs space to fill in. It needs shoulder room to stretch out and to grow. So keep that in mind. You don't want to plant things boom, boom, boom right next to each other. If you're buying plants to transplant into your garden, you're just wasting your money. You don't need that many plants to fill the space in most cases. I want to answer Courtney's question about how to effectively grow lettuce and arugula in large planter or big pot. That's a great question, and it's totally doable. We could be growing those, in our windows right now, all of us, if we wanted to. So, what I recommend is having more than one planter or pot. So let's say you've got one and you've sprinkled your lettuce seed on the top, and you've put some material on the top to cover the seed, and you water it. The soil is warm. It's got some moisture. You give it some light, and you're going to grow it. If you're doing it for like that cut lettuce that you cut, or arugula that you're just going to cut, then you're going to grow it you probably don't need to thin it down. You can probably just grow it in a big mass, as long as you don't, just look at how many seeds you're putting down. But you can probably grow it pretty thick, cut it all down, and then it's ready to eat. What people like, I think that might take, we're looking at 4 or 5 weeks, at the most to do that. Then why I say have multiple pots, because I want you to start one every week. So let's say you start one this week, and then next Thursday you start another one, and then you're going to have a succession of lettuce and arugula, and you're going to have that for weeks and weeks. Because once you do that first cut, you might get a second cut from it that will be okay, but usually subsequent cuts are not as nice. They don't taste as good. The texture isn't as nice. It's just not as good. So if you can turn that over, if you've cut it and you said, oh, we really enjoyed those salads, that was great, that was amazing. And guess what? Next week, I've got another one that's going to be ready to eat. And the week after that, I've got another one. And you probably could do 4 different pots and just keep them rotating, because you can reuse this, especially if you've got a lot of soil or material in the pot. You can amend it a little bit. You can reuse it. Because you're turning it over. So once that crop is done, once you've harvested your salad, incorporate the roots, let it break down, bury them, double dig the pot. So just invert the material and then plant it again. Hopefully that answers the question. Again, a little bit of water, a little bit of moisture, or a little bit of sun, a little bit of heat, and that arugula and that cut lettuce is super easy to grow.
Great. So there's 2 questions here that I labeled as problems people had. And one was relating to winter squash. Last year we struggled with powdery mildew on our squash. Do you have any hints on preventing that?
Can I answer that one?
And then there's a second question I'll try and pull up that got cut off. But,
okay.
Yep.
He's got the questions printed off, so it didn't come on the printout. But the powdery mildew or the downy mildew is super common. And actually, this is probably good for Aaron because roots to harvest gardens always have a lot of powdery mildew in both the community garden plots and in their garden plots. And it seems to come, so much. It seems to come too early. So in the city, and it just blows in. It's nothing you've done wrong. All the plants are susceptible to downy mildew and powdery mildew. What you want to do is first, when you're sourcing your seed or your plant, you want to look for a variety that is downy mildew or powdery mildew resistant. None of them are completely resistant to it, but they have resistance bred into them. So you want to look for a seed that has that ability. Or a plant, and you might not know, so you might just have to get what you can get. But that's one thing that you can do. Another thing you can do is not plant it too early, because if it sits there and the environment is cold and it's in cold soil and it's just sitting there and not growing, it's actually like using up its defenses. It's not thriving, and you want a thick, healthy plant. So if you plant your plant a little bit later when the conditions are good, it's going to start rooting right away. It's going to start growing right away. It's going to start fruiting right away. And it won't have that like downtime where it's kind of struggling and sort of trying to get its feet underneath of it. So wait a little bit longer. Don't plant it too early, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive. You think you get it out early and you get that plant growing, but actually I think you get better results if you plant a little bit later when the weather's good, and then it can just hit the ground running. And then you don't want to plant your plants too close together, because downy mildew goes on one plant and then it goes to the other plant, kind of like COVID-19. You just don't want them touching each other. And you do not want to handle your plants when they're wet. If the plants are wet, do not walk next to them. Do not touch them. Wait to harvest your fruit. There's zucchinis on them or whatever. If you're going in there to harvest, or cucumbers get it too, don't harvest when they're wet. Don't touch the plants when they're wet. Don't walk by them. Don't brush near them. Okay. So that's a big thing. Just wait until it's dry. So don't go in there in the morning because it's dewy. Wait until the afternoon to go and do your work, whatever that is, weeding, pruning, whatever. I think that will help. And then regardless, downy mildew, powdery mildew will almost always be the demise of your squash plants. But you want to try not to have that happen until September, when things are already kind of on their way out. So that's what you want to do, is just to try and push back the infestation of the mildew, of the fungus.
So fungus is the first decay organism. When things break down and die, fungus is the first thing that sets in to start to break it down, and it only starts to affect weakened tissues. So at the end of the season, as the plants start to senesce or naturally die back, they're vulnerable. It is pretty well inevitable that a fungus is going to land on them, or the spore, and then it's going to start to finish them off. It's kind of a foregone conclusion. But as Marcelle said, you're just trying to delay that from happening. And the best way to delay that is to make sure that your plants are on a strong trajectory of growth, and that they don't plateau or they don't suck wind or struggle any point along the way. Because again, if they're planted too early, they're going to be struggling, and then they're going to be susceptible. So it's just like, someone with a healthy immune system is going to be able to fight off infection better than someone who's already struggling. And so this really relates back to some of the really fundamental things we've talked about tonight about starting your garden. Just don't start too early. Make sure that the food is there for them, so that they're set up for success and they can go on a good trajectory of growth. Okay, so that the same person also asked the question, is there a good mulch that we can make from the yard waste, leaves, etc.? And how important is mulching around your plants? So before I answer that, I want to say that what mulch actually does, a mulch around the plant does a couple of things. It shades out the weeds. It suppresses weeds because it shades them out. It retains moisture. So that can be a good thing if you don't have an easy way to water, or your soil tends to dry out too quickly. And mulch tends to cool the soil temperature. Depending on what kind of mulch it is, it tends to keep the soil cooler than it otherwise would be if the sun were beating down on it. So knowing those three effects of mulch will dictate whether or not it's a good thing to do. So it really is quite crop specific. So if the crop really likes warm soil, like zucchini, winter squash, tomatoes, peppers, mulching, it may keep weeds down and keep moisture in, but it's going to actually make the soil cooler than the plant would otherwise want. So that probably wouldn't be a good use of it.
At least the leaf mulch.
Yeah. Well, any, I mean, unless you're using like a
black
plastic mulch where it's actually going to increase the soil temperature. But yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Another example, broccoli. So broccoli actually likes having a cooler soil. It's a cool season crop. And so if you're growing broccoli or that family of crops, mid-season, then putting mulch around that is actually going to be a benefit because it'll keep the moisture in, it'll keep the weeds down, and it'll keep the soil cool. So to answer your question, whoever this was, it really is quite crop specific. If the crop likes a hot soil, and without knowing too much about all the different crops, the crops that do well in the heat are the ones that on the seed package, it says, needs to germinate at 22 to 24. If the higher number there, it means it likes a higher soil temperature when it's actually growing. So that's tomatoes, cucumbers.
And, mulch is good because it's good to keep your soil covered, because it encourages, that exchange of biology. You can sometimes, depending on what the mulch is, you can sometimes, leave it in there or like work it in the fall time. And that just provides, good texture for the soil. So using mulches are good. We mulch with straw. We wouldn't be able to rake up enough leaves to mulch the field, but we buy straw and we mulch with straw. And then we just work it into the soil when we're finished. And, we use it mostly to suppress weeds in areas that we can't weed.
So the other thing with mulch, though, the organic mulches, so, straw, leaves, grass clippings, wood chips, those are all organic mulches, and that they were, or living at one point. They can also harbor pests, specifically slugs and things like that. So that's one of the detriments to it. Right. So the world of mulches is there's actually three types of mulches. There's the organic mulches, which I've just described, the straw, wood shavings, and so on. There are living mulches, which would be like a low-growing ground cover, like a low-growing clover or grass or something like that you could plant in the spaces between your plants. That's a living mulch. That will also suppress weeds by outcompeting, keep the moisture in, and keep the soil covered. And then there are artificial mulches like black plastic. I know people have used old pieces of carpet, cardboard, any number of things, wood planks, to keep the moisture down in your garden. So there's lots of different types of mulches. Every mulch will suppress weeds and keep moisture in. And depending on the type of mulch, it may either warm or cool the soil, and that may be either beneficial or negative, depending on the plant it's around. And then the final question is, I'm interested in any tips on what I can do to get the most out of a short growing season here in Northwestern Ontario.
There's another question that's kind of like that too, about extending the season.
Yeah, so why don't we just blend those together? So, and I think Marcelle probably have more to say on this than I, but I want to say that I don't actually feel that we are significantly disadvantaged as growers in Northwestern Ontario. I know it's not like the first place that comes to mind when you think about farming or gardening, but the reality is that we are able to grow pretty well everything they can in like southwestern Ontario, for example. Our spring is later and our spring is fast. So basically in my mind, we really don't have spring. It goes from like mud season to like, pretty well summer. So it's a fast and furious growing season. We get about 100 frost-free days. Usually the last frost, at least for us in Pass Lake, is usually around the 5th of June. Sometimes a lot earlier than that, but after the 5th of June, I kind of stop worrying. And our first frost in the fall, we've had years where it hasn't really come until the middle of October. but it's usually sometime around the third week of September or even the second week of September.
And in the city, you could add another week on either end because the city has a little bit more protection.
The city's warm because it's full of concrete, and concrete holds temperature really well. So that's actually a benefit to growing in the city. So anyway, a long-winded answer to say that what you can do to make the most of your growing season in that 90, 100-day frost-free window, using a lot of transplants. And
so that would mean like you would be starting things indoors, now. I've started my tomatoes and peppers. So if you're planning on growing tomatoes and peppers, seeding them indoors would be now. The alternative would be to purchase the plants because you don't want to put a tomato seed in the ground or a green pepper seed in the ground that you won't have success there. It needs more time. So you need to put a plant in the ground to grow those. And I think some of you probably know that, and there's probably some of you that don't know that. So you can also buy plants and they sell them everywhere. I know Roots to Harvest is doing tomato sale again this year. Our farm, Sleepy G Farm, is also growing a variety of plants for sale for folks' gardens. But then there's also like Bill Martin's and Vanderwees and places like Home Depot that sell plants too. Not that I necessarily would recommend those, but I'm sure there's some success people get out of those. But if you wanted to grow yours from seed, it would be now to start those things. And then as we get closer to outdoor season, you can start the other things. So I would start zucchinis and squash inside. I would start cucumbers inside. It's too soon now. Do not do it now. If you're going to grow onions from seed, then start those. Just trying to think what else. Broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage. I start all those. You don't have to put those seeds in the ground. I would start them in pots or buy the plants. Whereas other things need to be direct seeded, like your carrots and your beets and what else do you direct seed? Stuff like lettuce and arugula. Although I do transplant lettuce heads. It's nice to get a little lettuce like that, put it in the ground, and then 5 weeks later you have a lettuce head. That's really quite nice.
The thing with transplants is that, especially for those that have, and we're in the same boat, we have a limited amount of growing space. So it's nice if you're able to get, sneak 2 crops out of the same planter or garden space, whatever you're growing in. So an easy way to do that is using transplants. So as Marcelle said, with the example of little lettuce seedlings, you put them in the ground like this. Meanwhile, it's growing in the garden, getting bigger each day, and you've got some other seedlings growing in another place in pots or trays. And once this one comes out of the garden, this one can go into that same spot. And there's no downtime. There may be a turnaround of 1 or 2 days to take the one crop out and put the next one in. But that's really how you can squeeze the most of the season, is by propagating plants in trays and growing them to their a couple inches, 3 inches tall, and then putting them out. Because the thing is, while they're growing in the tray, the other crop is still growing out in your garden. And once it's done, there's no lost time. One thing I would say about transplants in general, people tend to start them way too early, and they tend to underestimate how much light they require. And unfortunately, that sunny window that you have in your kitchen is not enough light. It may seem like a lot to you, but if you're going to be growing plants inside, you want to have them in a sunny location like that window in your kitchen, but you also want to supplement with even like fluorescent lights, some sort of artificial light, because what happens is that if they don't have light for like 16 hours a day, then they will start to stretch. They'll get leggy, they get tall, their stem will get thin and brittle, and they'll get all stretched and leggy. And then you're putting this leggy, stretched kind of weakling type seedling out into your garden, and it's likely to die when it goes there. So when you're growing your own little transplants, you want to make them real stout and thick. And the best way to do that is give them tons of light, and even put, like I said, a little fluorescent light ballast. You could buy a Canadian Tire for $20 and get it nice and close to the plant. So like
8 inches above the plant.
like real close to the plant.
Carla wants to know when I recommend starting squash indoors. About 3 to 4 weeks before you intend to put them outside. So if you intend to put them outside at the beginning of June or at the end of May, I would start them like the first week of May. So you got lots of time to get your seed. That would be the same for winter squash, summer squash, which is zucchini, and also cucumbers and melons. So don't start those too soon because they'll just end up getting too big in your house, and then you put them outside and then they're going to be, like Brendan said, weak and skinny, and they're going to bust. So, and then they won't grow. So that's not, yeah, don't hurry on it. And it says on the back of the seed packet how many weeks before last frost. They assume that you're going to plant it just after the last frost. So if it says like plant 4 to 6 weeks before the last frost, consider last frost to be the day you intend to put it outside. So whatever, June, let's say June 1st. So then, just count back the weeks, get your calendar out, write it on your calendar. This week, I mean, what else you got going on? This week, start zucchinis, or whatever, write it on your calendar.
The other thing too is you'd be surprised that you can put out a much smaller little seedling than you would otherwise think. And to be honest, some of our best crops that we grow out in the field go in as little seedlings that are very, very small. Like they almost look pathetically small, but we found over years that when you put a young seedling out in the field, if the conditions outside are good, i.e. the soil is warm and the nights are warm enough and there's no risk of frost, that little seedling goes into the garden and it just keeps chugging along on that trajectory of growth. And sometimes if you start them too early and you put it out in the field and it's too big, older people are not as resilient and they don't adjust to change as easily as younger people, like little kids, right? And it's kind of the same thing, that if you put a little seedling out that's smaller and younger, it's going to be a bit more resilient. And so, yeah, don't jump the gun on starting stuff. Err on the side of being a little late than a little too early, I would say.
Before I answer any more questions on here, I just want to go back to extending the season because we didn't finish talking about that. So starting your seeds indoors is one way to get a jump start on the season. Digging your garden, if it's not time, it's not time now, but beforehand, you can dig your garden and let it dry out and get it ready. You don't want to plant the garden the same week that you prepare the soil. Like you don't want to do it the same day. You want to prepare the garden, get the soil ready, and then you want to let it settle and then maybe plant it the next week. So space it out. And like I said, write it on your calendar. You can say, okay, this week I'm going to plant the garden. So this is the week that I want to find time to dig it up. And then you choose a day that it's not raining and, that type of thing. So, plan it out ahead of time. Somebody, Kat, you mentioned using silage cover. So that's that black plastic we talked about. If you lay that out on your garden, even if you have an existing garden, the black side up, it's going to heat the soil, and that's going to give you a jump start. If you can get that soil heated ahead of time, and you'll know if it's warm when you put your hand in it.
Another trick too, if you've got a garden site, I don't think there's a lot of snow in the city, but sometimes there is at this time of year. If you have wood ash or even like sand or some
or a bale of peat moss, just go and sprinkle that over your garden, and because it's darker on the white, it will melt very quickly, and that's a good way to get the snow gone out of your garden site. Yeah. Will cardboard heat the soil? The answer is no. It'll insulate the cold in the soil and it'll be like a cooler. So don't use cardboard. But if it's a black plastic, if it's black and it'll sort of hold the heat, then that'll work. Landscape fabric could work in that same kind of way, like weed barrier, that type of stuff. Row cover. Row cover is like that white spun row cover. I know that Bowles Feed sometimes sells it, and I order mine from the seed companies, and it comes in big rolls. But yeah, a piece of row cover over your crops for sure. If you're chomping at the bit and you're like, I really, something like lettuce or spinach is fairly frost tolerant. If you're like, I really want to get that in the field or into my garden, you can plant it in your garden. But if it's still cold, then if it's before May long or the next weekend, you can cover it in this row cover, right? And you can leave it on day and night. You don't have to take it off during the day and leave it on at night. And you might want to just tent it with some wire hoops or something just to hold it above the crop. That works really well. If you want to know more about row cover, then we can talk about it more. Maybe we'll leave that. How much time we're getting towards the end here. I would recommend Googling floating row cover. If you're not already acquainted with it, figure out what it is, figure out where to buy it. If you are serious about gardening,
buying a roll of it would probably be the best investment you'll make in your garden, because you can use it for creating like a mini greenhouse over crops. You can use it to exclude pests if you have a pest outbreak. You can use it in the fall to give frost protection so you can keep things in the garden longer. You can use it to create a more moist environment for tender crops like, say, basil, which need to be humid. So row cover is extremely versatile.
And it's better than plastic. Like, it's better than putting plastic over your stuff like a greenhouse, because it breathes and you don't have to ventilate it.
Yeah, and it's relatively inexpensive, and you can use it over and over again for a few years for sure. Yeah, floating row cover, look it up, see if you can buy some. It'll be an excellent investment in your gardening.
And that can be used in the spring, but it can also be used in the fall to hold things over as things get colder and colder and the days get shorter. It's really nice. We don't use a ton of row cover, and Gavin's asked if we've ever used row cover plus polytunnels.
What's in our greenhouse right now?
Yeah, that's what we're doing in our greenhouse right now, but no, generally not. We don't use a lot of that row cover. It's expensive. It's kind of a pain in the ass, but on a garden level, it's amazing. But for us on a field scale, it's a lot harder. So we don't use a lot of row cover, although you probably know that we don't grow a lot of spring crops either. So yeah, that's not the type of gardening that we do, but I recommend it for the type of gardening that you do, because then you can eat stuff earlier and later into the season that you've grown yourself, which is awesome. Cold frames you can build, with some old windows, and kind of build boxes that have a window over the top. Again, those also often need to be ventilated. So just something to keep in mind, that your plants can get cooked in even in a cold frame. Anything else for season extension?
No, I think
you can also you can also use the row cover if you've seeded, put some seeds in the ground. You can put the row cover over top, and it'll hold the heat in the soil, so the seeds will germinate a little bit faster, and the moisture. You can peek under the row cover, see if anything's germinated yet. If not, you put the row cover back down, and that works really nice too. It's a great tool.
Yeah, I honestly can't say enough about row cover. We hate using it because it's like taking toilet paper and throwing it across the farm, but it really is a versatile product that is the difference between success and failure a lot of times. So I would really highly suggest you get some. And my only other suggestion around season extension is going back to the seeds. And when you're shopping for your seeds, really select based on the days to maturity, and make sure that you're selecting a variety of whatever it is, whether it's broccoli or lettuce or tomatoes, that is more suited to a shorter season growing climate. Because we can do all these interventions with plastic and row cover and all sorts of things, but the other intervention is to just use a crop that has already been bred to be done in that amount of time and not require intervention. So
I'm going to answer Katya's question about what type of soil do you need or what type of soil should I use for my seedlings indoors? So she wants to start some plants inside. She's read a bit about a soilless mixture. Is that necessary, or can I use regular potting soil in my trays? And you can use regular potting soil in your trays. I use just a commercial potting soil that's got perlite, and it's got some compost in it, and it's mostly peat. And it's light and fluffy, and you break it up, and you water it down. The key to using that type of product is actually to moisten it before you put any seeds in it, because you get all excited, you put it into your trays or your pots, and it's all fluffy and big, and you put the seeds in, and then you go to water them, and it like erupts and boils over like a potato pot on the stove. So make sure that you moisten it, and you get the texture, like put it into a Rubbermaid bin or something and moisten it down and kind of massage it in. And that's when you could mix in other stuff if you wanted to, like a bag of compost or some of your own compost if you've got nice compost, or some of your own garden soil if you wanted to mix that in there, and then water it and get the texture right, and then you can put it into your pots or your trays, and then you could put the seeds in it, and then put some dry material on top, not the wet stuff because it's too heavy. So sprinkle the dry material on top, and then you can spray it with your spray bottle to moisten it. And this is kind of, I don't know, maybe this is too much information, but I use like saran wrap to cover the tray with to make a little greenhouse. And maybe it's not so super sustainable because it's plastic wrap, but at the same time, it works mint. It's awesome. So I just put it on top. It makes a greenhouse on the tray. And when I see them to start germinating and start sprouting, I just remove the plastic, and then I can let them grow the little transplants in the tray like that. So hopefully that answers your question about what to use in your trays. It doesn't need to be one thing or the other, whatever you can access. Essentially, if you see that the plant's struggling a little bit, it could be you're not watering them enough. Chances are you're watering them too much. And then it could be that they might need a little bit of fertilizer if they've been in there for more than 2 or 3 weeks, because that's when they start to require more food.
Can you talk about how to transfer seedlings from indoors to outdoors?
Yeah, so
getting them ready.
If you started your stuff in the house and you want to get them ready to go outside, each day you should expose them to a little bit more of the outdoors. So the first day, for example, you could open the window, so a little bit of that cool air blows in. Not super cold though. If it's a cold day, don't open the window, like cold air blowing over your plants, you just want to do a little bit. So that could be the first day. And then the next day or a couple days later, you could put them outside the door, but bring them in at night, just see how they do. If you see that them starting to get like droopy out in the sun, the UV rays are too much. So you might want to put them in a shaded area instead of in direct sun. So just like, I don't know, I use a lot of, I go by intuition or how I think something looks or feels. So, if you think that it's too windy outside, don't put them outside, or if you think that the direct sun is too harsh, then put them in a shady area, and then bring them in at night if it's getting to be too cold. And then once you're getting ready to plant them outside, you can put your transplants, whether you grew them yourself or whether you bought them, you should leave them on your step overnight, at least outside, before you plant them out the next day.
And the ideal day for transplanting
is a cloudy day. Not the super sunny and definitely not a windy day. Windy days are the worst days to transplant your stuff outside. You can put seeds in the ground outside because they're not exposed to the air. But if you put one of your nice plants that you've either bought or you've grown out on a windy day and it gets all wind blown and dehydrated, and it's not good. So.
Okay, I'm going to talk to a question here about good bugs versus bad bugs and ways to encourage and discourage. So pests is something we haven't talked about. That could be another 2-hour conversation. But so the basics is that, most bugs in the garden are good. That's the good news. Most are good. And there are some bad ones out there. But, if your soil is healthy, you're going to have healthy plants. And those healthy plants will not put out signals that attract the bad bugs. And in fact, and if you have lots of diversity in your garden, there's going to be a diversity of bugs too. So the more different things you have in the garden, the more different types of creatures will be living in the garden in the form of bugs. The bad bugs their populations are usually kept in check by the good bugs, which can act as a predator. But every now and then that balance just isn't struck and you have a pest problem. And so you have to deal with the pest problem. And so without getting into all the different scenarios of all the different pests, there are a couple of common ones. I think the most common one are cabbage loopers, the little green caterpillars that chew holes through leaves. And cutworms is another one.
Somebody had a question about cutworms, and then also flea beetles is another one.
Okay, so those are probably the 3 big ones, at least in Northwestern Ontario. And we've dealt with all 3 of those a lot. Flea beetles, easy answer for that is row cover.
Row cover to the extent where every edge is buried under the soil. So, because they'll find a way to get in, right? So if you're using a spun row cover, like a agribon or a white cover, then you want to bury the whole thing all the way around the perimeter.
Yeah, keep the flea beetles out. You actually have to physically exclude them. There's no pesticide that will kill them. There's no real biological method. You just have to not let them get on the crop. The other thing is timing. So, for us flea beetles, we just don't even grow crops that are susceptible in the spring and early summer because unless we want to cover the whole farm in floating row cover, we're not going to be able to win that battle. So we just we just hold off on that crop until the days are shorter and cooler, and then we plant those crops in as a fall crop of, say, arugula or some of our broccolis and radishes even, which are all susceptible to flea beetles. So
I find that about after the middle of June, like June 15th, there isn't a lot of flea beetles anymore. They've kind of like had their day, they've come and gone, and that's over with, because everything has a cycle, right? Including these pests, and their cycle is usually, they're opportunists. They show up when they know the getting is good, and the getting's good first thing in the season when you put out all of your like little plants and when you're germinating all your little seeds. If you can trick them by just planting a little bit later once they've already moved on, then that you can win that way too.
Yeah, and just think about it this way too. There's not a lot growing. Even the grass is hardly growing by the beginning of June. So you put all these tender little seedlings out that you grew or you bought from the nursery, and it's like the buffet table for these pests who have, like you and I, have had a long winter and are hungry and looking for some, looking for a good time. So those that have dealt with potato beetles will find that same thing, that they can be a constant struggle with potato beetles. Easy way to beat them is don't plant your potatoes till July 1st. Or at least late June. And I know that sounds crazy, but you can trust me, it'll work, because they will come in the spring. They won't find what they're looking for. They'll bugger off, and then you put your potatoes in the ground, no problem.
Yeah, the other school of thought is just to plant your potatoes or whatever, and then pick them off. And like, that's totally doable on a backyard garden scale, and that's the same with the cutworms, and that's the same with the caterpillars, or the cabbage loopers, I should say, or the imported cabbage worms, those green ones on your cabbage and kale. So you can pick them all off. It is possible. I know it's like, oh really, but if you pick them and crush them all off, then you don't have a problem, and it might take you an hour to do your garden, but at the same time, that's an hour well spent, because then you're actually going to be able to eat the food, and it's not going to be covered in caterpillar shit.
So the other thing is, the best way to fight pests is through observation. And that's easy for me to say because I actually don't do it that much. Marcelle's kind of the one who does that. But, if you're standing in your garden admiring it, or you're watering it, or you're having a beer in your backyard and you're looking at your garden and you see these little white moths or butterflies fluttering around your garden, you should be asking yourself, what is it doing? And is this going to be a problem? And it might not be, but it might well be. And so once you've seen that happen, then you need to start keeping a close eye on those crops in the following days. And if you get down on your hands and knees, very often you will find little eggs laid on the leaves, which then hatch in a few days, and they hatch as little caterpillars, which then start to eat your crop. So observation is the trick for pests. And the final question I want to address with regard to pests is keeping deer out of the garden. Someone said that they live in the country. Electric fence. Honestly, electric fence. You can buy an electric fence unit, a cheap one, for about $100, and the wire is like a spun poly. You can either attach it to wood sticks, or you can buy the little step-in post. But you make a little perimeter well around your garden, so not the actual margins of your garden, but a larger area. And electric fencer just puts a little shock on a pulse, and a curious deer or rabbit or neighbor's dog or child will investigate, touch it, and get zapped. And it won't kill it, but it'll tell it that this is not a fun place to be.
So if you want more information about the electric fence, because we kind of blew through that quick, then send us an email if that's something that you want to add. Sarah just asked if Lowell has anything he'd like to add. Lowell's in bed, so I'm not going to wake him up to ask him the question. Lowell's a baby. And then Gavin asked, what plants do you usually have available? So this is the first year we're doing a plant sale, so I don't usually have anything available, but I am growing for the plant sale literally thousands of plants, and anything from anything that would be transplanted. So there'll be lettuces, there'll be kale, cabbage, there'll be squash and cucumbers, tomatoes, zucchini. It's gonna be an online order. I'll probably be pre-assembling people's orders for them so that we can everybody can get their plants safely. So stay tuned. I'll get Erin to share my ad when it comes out.
Awesome. So before we totally wrap up, there's a couple things I just wanted to, I'm glad you mentioned your plant sale. There was one other question too that somebody asked about growing on front lawns in Thunder Bay. So so you can grow on your lawn in Thunder Bay. Like everybody has gardens in their front yards, like flower gardens or whatever, and you can stick some food in there. People are not allowed, as far as I know, to like straight up farm their front yards. That said, I think there's lovely ways to do it. So I know that Brendan and Marcelle advocate for growing in the ground, but growing in raised beds in these like aesthetic areas are actually pretty good ways of solving that. So at my house, part of my garden is in my front yard, but they're in these like cedar beds, and it's, you know, it looks nice. So part of it's aesthetic. And then there's the other thing about it's also bylaw driven or complaint driven. So it may be a bylaw, and check with your neighbors. Are you cool with this? I'm gonna weed my garden, and don't be a jerk about it. Keep it looking nice.
Well, yeah, and I saw somebody's front yard garden once that had like a bunch of tires, and they're growing in like old tires.
Yeah.
There's a reason somebody complained about that. It looks bad.
And you ruin it for other front yard gardens. And Courtney's just saying like absolutely call before you dig. If you're going to dig up your front yard or like anywhere in the city, you have to call before you dig. And they'll just come and spray it. It's free. You don't have to worry about it, but do the call before you dig line. So just to wrap up, I know there was another question we didn't get to about cover crops, but.
Yeah, so I did see that one, Erin. So Megan's question about cover crops. If you're not chomping the bit to use that garden this year, then doing the double digging and creating the site, and then seeding it very densely with, field peas, oats, things that you can buy cheap at the feed store, and then let them grow but not mature, and then incorporate in the soil and do it a second time in the same season. That would be ideal. If you were able to do that in one season, you would be in an excellent position for the following season for a garden.
Send us an email, Megan, if you want to talk about it more. Brendan will give you explicit instructions if you intend to do that.
I'll even sell you the seed.
Okay. One of the things that we do at Roots is before when we were in a smaller space, we used to sort of do it like Martha Stewart. We would plant clover in our rows, like in our walkways.
I remember that.
And, it just like looked and felt nice, and then we just dig it all in. And then often when we dig stuff up, we cover crop it right at the end of the season too. So, but yes, cover cropping is super helpful. And then the other thing I wanted to just show, so I have a seed packet here. So there's like on a lot of the seed pack, nobody can read that. Anyway, on the seed packets, can you? It says
yeah, there you go.
It says like plant April to May. And what we've told people is like, when you get a seed packet from anywhere else, like even if it's from Bessie Seeds or even if it's like from William Dam, like add 3 weeks. Like you need to add some time. Those are not Thunder Bay dates. So like I feel like that is sometimes what inspires our impatience here is like, but it says do this, or like as soon as the thing's like, no, like you need to add 3 weeks. So I just wanted to point that.
It's hard too because we have so much daylight hours that you really feel like you should be outside doing stuff like that, but it's not time.
Yeah, agreed. And so in summary, I think that there are some nice takeaway messages, and I wanted to summarize them. One of them was, I think you guys both said, treat your zucchinis like they have COVID. So, we learned that, keep your scythes sharp so that you can get your lawn going. We know that old people don't adjust to change, and
or maybe just me.
And that like you and I at a buffet table, we're all just looking for a good time. So,
I think Brendan said all of those things.
I did. He did. That's why I wrote them down. Sorry, Marcelle.
Thanks,
I think that you corrected him most of those times. But I really love doing this. And Brendan and Marcelle, I just thank you from all of us. I know that, people can't speak, but thank you so much for your time and for helping make this possible on such short notice too. It's really exciting to be thinking about growing. And like Marcelle, you said, what else are you going to do? So may as well grow some food.
Yeah.
And we will keep people, we'll let you know about your seeds, like the plant sale, and when and where that will happen and how to order and all those sorts of things. So.
Well, and I think there's still opportunities for us to work together on the plant sale stuff, but that's upcoming.
Yeah, totally. So social media on both CPG and Roots to Harvest. Roots to Harvest has a newsletter that we're actually like writing more and more in lately. So you can always join our newsletter. But everybody, if you could just, stay safe, stay home, and maybe we can get out of this sooner than later.
Yeah, really.
And we will share the recording.
This was really fun for us.
Yeah. Thanks, Erin.
Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome. Take care, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.